Ever since the first Volvo rolled off the assembly line last century, the brand has been synonymous with safety. But the brand has also undergone a serious renaissance over the last about 5 years or so, and it all started with this generation XC90. Prior to the Volvo Renaissance, where we got this platform and this design language in the entire product line at this point, Volvo was really in kind of an odd position in the luxury segment, because a lot of folks out there didn't really think that the Volvo vehicles were at the same level of BMW and Mercedes vehicles when it came to engineering, when it came to design, when it came to luxury features, etc. But they were certainly a luxury car company in a different sort of way. A staunch Mercedes owner, I think, explained it best to me once when he said, if you go to the country club in a BMW or a Mercedes, everybody's going to think that your finances are just fine. But if you roll up in an Acura, people are going to wonder what happened to your trust fund. On the other hand, if you roll up in a Volvo, they're probably just going to think you're oddly sensible, but you still fit in somehow. That brand perception is definitely important because it leads a lot of folks to think that perhaps Volvo previously wasn't a full-on luxury manufacturer. Perhaps they were more of a premium manufacturer or a near-luxury manufacturer where we see Buick, where we see, oddly enough, really Cadillac, Lincoln, and Acura. But with their latest generation of products, Volvo is really trying to change that. In this video, we're obviously going to be talking about the XC90 right next to me. This is one of my top picks in the three-row luxury crossover segment, but we're also going to be talking about Volvo's electrification future. This is the plug-in hybrid version of the XC90, and we're going to be talking about Volvo's renaissance. That renaissance all started with the XC90 about 5 years ago. It's where this design language first got started, with the Thor's hammer full LED headlamps that we find here that are quite distinctive, the elegant but still angrier front end than we've seen in Volvo models of the past, and an exterior and interior design that no longer looks just sensible, but it looks elegant and luxurious. When Volvo debuted this generation a little over 5 years ago, a lot of folks out there were surprised because Volvo designed an all-new platform for use in their midsize and larger vehicles. They didn't simply rehash something that they had before. And when Volvo says all new, they really mean all new. New engines, new transmissions, completely new body structure, new suspension designs, new interior designs, new electronics, etc. And this new platform is what gives us the most striking feature about the modular platform, and that is this long hood proportion. You'll notice that we have a hood length that definitely feels much more like what we'd find in a rear-wheel drive vehicle, even though the XC90 and this entire platform was designed around front-wheel drive vehicles to start with. You'll notice that, of course, in the front overhang, which is a little bit longer than we'd find in a BMW or a Mercedes, but like the BMW and Mercedes competition, the dash-to-axle ratio is definitely on the longer side, very different than what we see in the Lexus RX or an Acura MDX. And oddly enough, also a little bit different than what we see in an Audi Q7 that has a slightly longer front overhang because their engines are entirely in front of the front axle. The long hood and tall front end proportion certainly gives the XC90 a presence that the previous generation could never quite muster. But it was born as much out of styling as it was out of safety. This platform was designed for not only complete electrification at some point in the future, we'll see that in version 2 of this platform at some point soon, but also the plug-in hybrids that debuted with the XC90 and we now see across their entire lineup. Volvo has arguably been more aggressive at developing their plug-in hybrid drivetrains than any other luxury manufacturer. And even though BMW sells more plug-in hybrids in total in the United States, Volvo sells more plug-in hybrids as a percentage of their vehicle sales. Volvo has positioned their plug-in hybrids also a little bit differently than BMW or Mercedes because this is the performance option in the Volvo lineup. This is the drivetrain that gives you 400 horsepower and over 470 pound-feet of torque in every vehicle that it's in, over 20 miles of range in every vehicle that it's in, including this XC90. It's the most expensive engine option, it's the most powerful engine option, it's the most efficient engine option as well. And arguably, it's also the drivetrain that's been getting a little bit more development dollars over the years because we now have a third-generation battery pack, even though the XC90 has only been on the market for 5 years. When designing the XC90, I think they did a really good job of incorporating some design cues from previous generations of Volvo's products, like this really strong hip profile that we find out back, really accentuated by the way that the hatchback integrates with these tail lamp modules. Now on the downside, for some reason, Volvo decided to give us red turn signals in the United States. They are, of course, amber in Europe. I asked an engineer about that at the launch of the XC90 5 years ago, and they basically said they thought that Americans liked red turn signals. So if you're an amber fan, let me know down there in the comment section below. And shameless plug, we have Save the Amber Lamps t-shirts available in the Alex & Autos merch store. You can find that down there as well. In theory, you probably could swap out a European tail lamp module with the amber lights in the XC90 if you really wanted to. Now, what's odd about Volvo's transition to red lamps is that we then have an XC40 with amber lamps. Go figure. Fortunately, when the Volvo engineers decided to copy Audi with the red turn signals, they decided not to follow along with the fake exhaust tips at the bottom. So those are real. Exhaust gases actually flow through them. When you pop the hood, you'll notice that there is an enormous amount of room between the very front of the vehicle and the engine itself. It's nearly 20 inches or so. Again, this platform is designed to accommodate just four-cylinder and smaller engines for crash reasons and for environmental reasons. And that's why we find this plug-in hybrid system right here. If you want your new vehicle to have a little bit of everything, the XC90 should be on your menu because this is turbocharged, it's supercharged, it's hybridized, and it has a plug. Here's how the hybrid system works. We have a 2-liter 4-cylinder turbocharged and supercharged engine that gives us 316 horsepower, and it's driving the front wheels only through an 8-speed automatic transmission designed by Aisin. Interesting bit of trivia, this is essentially the same 8-speed automatic transmission that we find under the hood of the Lexus RX 350. Between the engine and transmission lies an integrated motor generator unit that produces 46 horsepower and 111 pound-feet of torque. Now, that part is similar to what we find in BMW and Mercedes plug-in hybrids. However, Volvo didn't just stop there. They gave this an e-all-wheel drive system, sort of like what we see in the Lexus product line, but taken to the next level. So in the back, we find a separate electric motor that produces 87 horsepower and 177 pound-feet of torque. But the key difference between this kind of e-all-wheel drive system and what we find, for instance, in the Lexus RX hybrid is that the rear electric motor in this vehicle can deliver 87 horsepower and 177 pound-feet of torque for a lot longer and a lot more often. And that's because we have a battery that is considerably larger. This is the third generation of battery in the XC90 plug-in hybrid. It started out at 9.4 kilowatt hours, then 10.4 kilowatt hours, and now we have 11.6 kilowatt hours, giving this a little bit more range and likely longer lifetime as well. Volvo says that they're continually refining the chemistry, and unlike some companies out there that just give you one system and then that hangs on for 5 or 10 years, Volvo continuously tweaks their vehicles just like we see in a lot of European competition as well. So that's why we see some changes within product life cycles. So even though the XC90 hasn't really received too much of a refresh since it launched, we do see these successive changes year on year. The way this hybrid system is designed, up to 174 horsepower and 354 pound-feet of torque maximum, approximately, this vehicle can send power equally front and rear via an all-wheel drive mode in the center console. And that's where this feels very different than the Lexus all-wheel drive systems, because in the Lexus system, the battery cannot deliver that much oomph. This battery pack is capable of dissipating more power than the rear electric motor can consume in its own right. So the rear electric motor could be absolutely maxed out, and then that electric motor could deliver some additional oomph to the front electric motor to either help out with torque fill or to restart the engine whenever it's needed. But you'll notice a big difference dynamically between this system and the plug-in hybrid systems that we find under the hoods of the German competition. This system will never send as much power to the rear axle as it will to the front. Just 87 horsepower to the back, 316 to the front. And torque-wise, 177 out back, 295 on the front axle. We'll obviously go into this a little bit more in the drive section, but that means that this is one of the few vehicles, oddly enough, that if the conditions are right, can give you oversteer and torque steer at the same time. Because Volvo has programmed this electric motor to give you a decent amount of shove to the rear, so you can in some situations get the rear end to kick out just a teeny tiny little bit, but also get torque steer at the exact same time. Obviously, Volvo is absolutely obsessed with safety, but they go about things a little bit differently than the competition. Some parts of that I really like, and some parts just leave me scratching my head, to be honest. For instance, we're in the 21st century, but we don't have all the same kind of active safety technologies standard on new Volvo models that we do find in, for instance, Acuras and Lexuses. On the other hand, of course, Volvo does include a ton of active safety technologies standard on the XC90, and a ton of passive safety features that we don't necessarily find in all the competition. Now in this video, I'm not going to dissect Volvo's active and passive safety philosophies completely, but suffice it to say, Volvo tends to design for real-world crashes, not just government tests. That is important to keep in mind. We also find a lot of safety features on the XC90 that you won't find in some of those less expensive luxury vehicles, like pre-tensioners and load limiters in more seating positions than we find, for instance, in an Acura MDX. So even though you may get the same government crash test rating, generally speaking, in a wider variety of crashes, the XC90 would logically be safer, would give you lower loads on the body, would be safer for those passengers all around the vehicle, not just in the front seats. But on the other hand, again, I'm a little bit disappointed that we don't have more of those technologies standard on every model in the Volvo lineup. In my opinion, every Volvo sold in North America should have blind spot monitoring, should have their semi-autonomous driving system, all that sort of stuff as standard equipment. Today we're driving the top-end XC90. These are the most adjustable seats available in this model. We have four-way adjustable lumbar support, an extending thigh cushion, inflatable side bolsters. We also have an available seat massage that this vehicle has, and it's one of the best massages available in the luxury segment. But there also are a few oddities here. For instance, we don't have a powered tilt telescopic steering column. It has a good range of motion, and it is definitely faster to adjust it manually, but there's no way to memory link it with the 3-position memory over there on the driver's door. But Volvo giveth and Volvo taketh away, because the passenger seat has the exact same range of motion as the driver's seat, it has the massage, and it has a 3-position memory. But then another oddity is that we have fixed in place headrests. Now Volvo has said before that that's because a lot of people don't adjust their headrests properly, so they decided to give us a design that works for most people out there. But an odd twist about that is that Volvo has made models with adjustable headrests, including the XC40. Hopping into the second row, we find legroom that's pretty generous. Remember that the XC90 is about the same length as something like a Toyota Highlander, so this is not a really big 3-row crossover. Even on the outside, it has this bold, boxy presence that we don't see necessarily in the Highlander that makes it seem like the XC90 is bigger. It's not really. It's about the same size. And that's why we find about the same kind of combined legroom in here. With this front seat adjusted for me at 6 feet tall, I have about 6 inches of legroom left. The second row seats do slide forward and backwards, that way you can apportion the space a little bit more equitably with the seats in the way back. And if I scoot all the way over to the right side of the car, you can see that I have about 2 inches left. This front seat is all the way back in its tracks. For 2020, the XC90 is available as a 6-seat or a 7-seat crossover. The 2-row 5-seat version is gone. Apparently, customers had been asking for captain's chairs in the second row for quite some time, and Volvo finally decided to give in. One thing worth noting, we don't find any armrests on the inboard side of these second row seats, and I do find that just a little bit odd, because there's really nowhere for that second row passenger to put your elbow. It's also worth noting that unlike some entries in the luxury segment like the Infiniti QX60 and some entries in the mainstream segment, you cannot leave a child seat latched into place and still tilt and slide this seat forward. And while I'm complaining about things, these little trim strips right here give the seat a very finished look from the third row when the second row is in place, but these seem like they're really going to be snapped off pretty easy when a kid hops in the way back and kicks them on their way in or out. Now, if you get the 6-passenger version of the XC90, there is, of course, another way to get into the way back, and that would be right here between the two captain's chairs, possibly part of the reason why they didn't give us armrests right there. Now, if I hop into the way back and then recline that seat all the way back there, all the way back in its tracks, my knees are definitely digging into this seat. Although the XC90 is pretty big for Europe, remember this is not X7 or GLS size. This is X5 and GLE sized, so we find very similar kind of room in the back. You do find a smidge more third row room in the Q7. Although you could put adults back here in relative comfort, my knees aren't exactly in my chest. It's not like we have a lot of leg support. Again, very similar to what we find in the X5 and GLE. I think I would prefer to spend my time in this third row, however, over the X5 and GLE just because of the seat bottom cushion and its relative position to the floor. It seems to be a little bit higher off the ground, giving me slightly better thigh support as an adult back here. But it's obvious when we take a look at the plastics that are so luxurious up front, a lot of stitched leather going on there on the rear passenger door there. But then we move back here to the third row, we find a lot of hard plastics. It's pretty obvious that this rear area was designed for cargo and really designed to have these third row seats folded most of the time, just like most 3-row crossover shoppers do. On the bright side, third row passengers do get some small air vents over here on each side and then some tiny cup holders as well. Although the Q7 is about 5 inches longer than the XC90, we really don't find that much more interior room, and we actually have a smidge less cargo room. Like most luxury 3-row crossovers, that means that you could not put 6 people and their luggage in the back of the XC90, let alone 7, but you could put 4 or 5 people's luggage in the back relatively easily. This XC90 has the optional adaptive air suspension. That means we have buttons right over here that allow you to lower the ride height of the XC90 so that we can more easily put some larger items in it. If we lift up the load floor, we find a tiny amount of storage space and a nice touch, which is a dual voltage charge cord. This is one of the few vehicles that gives you a 240 volt cord standard with the vehicle. Now, this is not a fast 240 volt charger, but it is obviously going to be faster than just plugging in on 120 volts. Going for an even deeper dive, we don't find a spare tire, again pretty typical for European vehicles. Instead, we have a can of Fix-A-Flat, and then this is where we find the reservoirs for the captive air suspension system. Volvo positions the majority of the active safety sensors, including the radar sensor, right here behind the rear view mirror. This means that if the XC90 gets involved in a minor fender bender, the system is not going to be affected, but it also means that if you live in an area with a lot of snow, snow is not going to accumulate there because, of course, this area is cleared by the windshield wipers. So as long as you can see outside, the safety system should be able to do that as well. With the buttons for the telematics system there and the control for this large panoramic moonroof. You can see as we move around, we have the top end trim, so we do have the Alcantara headliner there. Interior design is definitely cited as a strong reason to buy one of the modern Volvos, and we certainly see that in a lot of nice touches like these leather-wrapped sun visors. Moving to the back, you can see that that large panoramic moonroof extends to just over the second row passengers' heads. We have height adjustable shoulder belts for the second row in addition to the front row. We also have those well-integrated window shades back there, and basically the same level of build quality to those rear doors that we find, and we're going to take a look at here in a bit in the front. Since we're driving the inscription trim that's embossed on the headrest, these are leather seats, again, active massage, active ventilation, and heat. Essentially, the entire door panels are made from soft touch materials. Then we have a lot of stitched premium materials on the top of the door, like the leather wrap that this particular door has here. There's a lot of open pore real wood trim as well, metal speaker grates. You can see the 3-position memory over there for the passenger. We also have the optional Bowers & Wilkins sound system, which is kind of a pricey option on modern Volvos, but I guess it's a little bit less expensive than the systems that we find in the Mercedes lineup. Moving over to the dashboard, we have that strong stitching line and strong arc continuing across the dashboard, more of that real wood trim there. The glove compartment control is over here on the dashboard. We have a combination of bin and slot style glove compartment. I was just barely able to fit a large tablet computer inside. Again, a lot of leather treatment going on here on the dashboard, a lot of soft touch materials as well. In the center of the dash, we have the infotainment system, which I think has aged relatively well, but the screen is starting to seem just a little bit small. As we see with a few other European companies, Volvo likes to make incremental changes year on year. So if you didn't like the way this infotainment system operated 4 or 5 years ago, you may want to give it another chance because it certainly is snappier than it was before. Volvo says that they've given the system a significantly faster processor, and it is noticeable. Now, there is still a little bit of lagginess. It's still not quite as snappy as I might like, but as you can tell, interacting with the system is certainly a lot easier than it was before, and it doesn't take as long after the vehicle has started to get into a lot of those systems. Personally, I find this system a little bit more intuitive and easier to use than the latest Mercedes M-Bucks system, but M-Bucks does give you a lot of features that we don't find in this Volvo infotainment system. Volvo has said that this is going to be the last generation of this software. The next generation is going to be based on Google's Android operating system. We should be seeing that very soon. Down here we see the only physical buttons for the system. We have that button for the glove compartment there, power and volume knob with a play and pause button right there, controls for the front and rear defoggers, track forward, backward. Below that, we have some small storage areas with these roller covers. This is wood trim there again, 12-volt power port, 3 cup holders. These 2 are more round, and that one is a little bit square. And then we have a joystick-style shifter. This does have the crystal shifter since we're in the T8 model. This is a double-tap style shifter. You do get used to it, but some people think that it's odd right up front. To get out of park and into drive, we toggle that back twice. If you want to go from drive to reverse, you just toggle it forward twice. So it is a double-tap style shifter. If you want to toggle between the manual mode, so once we're in drive, you then toggle side to side if you want to change the gear manually. The engine start-stop button is this toggle right here. We then have a drive mode selector. We press this down and then rotate it around, or press the button down and then select the option from the screen. If we choose the off-road mode, then the vehicle will automatically raise the suspension if you have the adaptive suspension. Behind that, we have the electric parking brake, auto brake hold, and then a small storage compartment that's just barely able to keep one of these larger smartphones in there with the cable connected. The storage compartment is on the small side because this is where the battery pack lives. Volvo puts the battery pack from right about there under that infotainment system all the way to right about there in the vehicle. That positions the weight very centrally. It's not quite as low as it might be in some vehicles, but it also is right in the middle of the vehicle, which is good for handling and good for protecting the battery in the event of an accident. On the driver's side, we find a full LCD instrument cluster. This does change modes a little bit based on the drive mode. So if I move over to the pure mode, you get something a little bit different than that tachometer on the right. And you can change its theme via the infotainment system in the center of the dashboard. But this display is not as configurable and just not as exciting looking as the latest Mercedes large LCD instrument clusters. However, as far as configurability and theme changes, this is pretty similar to what we see in most BMW models. It also doesn't have quite the same kind of wow factor we find in some of the Audis out there with the large LCD that gives us Google satellite imagery. But it is worth noting that you have to pay monthly for that satellite imagery after your initial subscription goes away. We control that display via this button over here on the steering wheel, but there isn't too much to control. We can just cycle through the trip computer readouts, the media, the phone, and navigation interfaces that are designed specifically for this screen. In our testing, the XC90 T8 took 4.9 seconds to go 0 to 60 and stopped from 60 miles an hour back to 0 in 117 feet. Those are both pretty decent scores for a luxury 3-row crossover. Keep in mind that the model that we're driving has pretty wide 275 with tires on it. They're also a little lower profile than we find in the base version of the XC90, so logically, depending on the version that you get, those scores will obviously move around. You'll notice that 0 to 60 time is definitely faster than pretty much all the hybrid and plug-in hybrid competition. That's again because Volvo is positioning this system a little bit differently. And this definitely behaves differently than the Lexus RX hybrid system, even though in some ways they would seem pretty similar with the electric rear axle in the back. You'll really notice the difference in the corners here, because if you start pushing the XC90 harder, this has a really solid, confident feel to it. Some of that has to do with suspension design. We have a double wishbone suspension up front, not a McPherson strut arrangement like we found in the previous generation of the XC90, or honestly in a lot of the less expensive competition, whether we're taking a look at something like an Infiniti QX60 or an Acura MDX. We also have considerably wider tires than we have on some of those models. Volvo not only designed this platform to have that more elegant front suspension, to accommodate the air suspension setup, to accommodate electrification, but also to accommodate wider tires than any Volvo platform before. So 275 with tires on this particular model. Now these are not as wide as you'll find in the German rear-wheel drive competition, of course, especially in the back of some of those options. So obviously we're talking about a particular slice of the luxury segment here when we're talking about performance scores. Comparably priced, this will handle pretty well. It's not going to have the same dynamic feel that we find in a BMW or a Mercedes because this is not rear-wheel drive, but grip is not really going to be that far off. And honestly, this feels better than the Audi Q7. Depending on how you have the XC90 configured, it may be a little bit lighter than the Q7, and the weight is going to be better balanced in the XC90 than in the Q7, especially when we're talking about a Q7 with performance that is closer to this plug-in hybrid model. Volvo also, I think, wisely decides to march to a different drummer. So they didn't try and duplicate BMW or Mercedes suspension designs. This really has a character all to its own. And either you like it or you don't. Personally, this fits me and I think it's just fine, but because handling is not going to be quite at that same level as some of the more expensive and more powerful BMWs and Mercedes, the handling score has to remain a B here. Although the XC90 has an adaptive air suspension, this suspension never gets quite as soft as an air suspension that you'd find in, say, a Lexus LS500. Keep in mind that the XC90 was designed for a European audience, and Volvo decided really to give us a very similar tune for the US market. So this feels an awful lot like a Mercedes-Benz or a BMW in a similar price and performance range. When it comes to the ride score, I'm going to give this model a B. When we take a look at a Mercedes-Benz GLE with its adaptive air suspension, it does end up being a little bit softer. And obviously, if you were really concerned about suspension comfort and soaking up all of those imperfections on the road, then you could get something like a Lexus RX hybrid. It's certainly going to be smoother than the XC90. But the XC90 isn't harsh by any measure. It soaks up the bumps pretty well. It just has that firmer, more confident European tune to the suspension. In our cabin noise test at 50 miles an hour, we got 71 decibels in this cabin. That does make this a little bit louder than the BMW X5. Now, some of that may have to do with the tire choice that we have on this model, but it is worth noting that the last X5 we drove actually had wider tires than this model, and it was still just a little bit quieter. The XC90 is definitely quiet. We got a better cabin noise score in here than we last did in the Acura MDX, but it's just not that next level in quietness that one might expect. Now let's diverge from the scores and talk about the differing drive modes. So if I dig around here, we have a constant all-wheel drive mode. That's kind of an intriguing mode and one that we don't find in the Lexus hybrid. That's one of the reasons that this feels much more confident on snow or on slippery terrain or even in mild off-roading situations than the Lexus hybrid. A lot of that comes down to the battery, as I said before. This battery can put out more oomph than the electric motor in the rear can consume in its own right. Now, why would they bother designing the battery to be like that? Well, think about this. If you're in the pure mode and you want to drive electric only, this is going to be a rear-wheel drive vehicle, very interestingly enough, because the electric motor's in the back. So rear-wheel drive when electric only, but then you need more oomph. You want to pass someone. You want that level of performance even when you're in the eco-friendly mode. Come up to this corner and you decide you want to punch it. Well, Volvo wants to give you some thrust immediately, so they're going to max out the electric motor in the rear, and then they need some extra oomph to start the engine up front and also help give you that build in acceleration that you're expecting. Then that's where the supercharger takes over because it doesn't need to spool up like a turbocharger does, so that's going to give you that instant acceleration from the engine. And then at those higher speeds, and in order to improve efficiency in steady state travel, the turbocharger is going to kick in and boost you at that point. It's obvious out on the road that this system delivers significantly more power than we find out of the Lexus hybrid system, or really out of the Acura MDX Sport hybrid system as well. And a lot of that really does have to do with that battery. It also has a different feel. It feels a little bit more urgent and a little bit better put together than the Lexus system as well. Braking performance and braking feel is also better. The integration and transition between regen braking and friction braking is certainly better handled in the Volvo. But this is never going to feel quite like a 400 horsepower, 4.9 second German option, because they're going to feel a little bit more traditional. And there's always going to be a slightly different feel going on in the Volvo. Again, that ability to have torque steer and a little bit of oversteer at the same time. If you dig deeper into the throttle, you really do get both, because this can send a reasonable amount of torque to the rear, but then there's still a whole lot of power going on up front. And that's, again, something that you either have to be okay with or you're not. Personally, it doesn't bother me. I find it strangely intriguing if you're out on your favorite winding mountain road. Now, not quite as exhilarating as an Alfa Romeo or a BMW with really great steering feel and that rear-wheel drive nature, but still fun in its own right. The other area where Volvo's hybrid systems really excel is fuel economy. Over a week of mixed driving, we've been averaging 27.6 miles per gallon in this XC90. And remember, this is a plug-in hybrid with a big old battery pack right here and 400 horsepower, 0 to 60 under 5 seconds in a 3-row crossover. That is a little bit better than the last RX hybrid that we drove, and significantly faster. And if you have the ability to plug in your XC90, then you can shift some of that consumption from gasoline over to electricity. Our fuel economy numbers that I'm talking about here are not including charging. Volvo's metamorphosis has been incredibly successful, and I think the XC90 is the perfect example of that, because this is the oldest iteration of the design language that really kicked off their metamorphosis, and it has aged incredibly well. I still think that the XC90 is one of the most handsome entries in this luxury 3-row crossover segment. Let me know what you think about that down there in the comment section, and it also has managed to still be very well priced. Even this plug-in hybrid version here ends up just over $62,000 if you qualify for the maximum full federal tax credit, and logically, if you're shopping for a big luxury 3-row crossover, you're going to qualify for that full credit. That means that for about the same price, you could get something like a all-wheel drive BMW X5 or an all-wheel drive Mercedes-Benz GLE that is significantly slower than this, significantly less fuel efficient than this, and won't let you drive in the carpool lane all by your lonesome, like you can in the XC90 in some states. And that's logically why XC90 sales have been absolutely excellent in the US and worldwide. Worldwide sales have topped 100,000 units really for the first time ever in the XC90, and US sales are at their peak, basically. They topped out in 2004 just a little bit higher than they did in 2019, but the XC90 has been gaining sales momentum year after year because it's still a very solid luxury 3-row crossover. Now, is it the right luxury 3-row crossover for everyone? No. Here at Alex and Autos, I prefer to shy away from statements like the best ever, the best vehicle in a segment, because honestly, everyone's needs are different. Personally, I need to tow in my 3-row crossover, so that is one reason that you may need to cross the XC90 off your shopping list. We also don't find 8 seats back there. There are a few things that you might like a little bit better in the BMW or the Mercedes. If you're seriously interested in driving dynamics, if you want that rear-wheel drive feel, that's not going to be able to be duplicated in the T8 model of the XC90. But I think that for 90% of shoppers out there, the XC90 is going to be an excellent option. And if I were shopping just on looks alone, inside or outside, the XC90 would be a winner. Also, if I were shopping for value, performance for the dollar, or safety, XC90 would be at the top of my shopping list. And now something that Volvo is also becoming synonymous with, but they weren't really before, efficiency. If you're looking for one of the most efficient 3-row crossovers in this segment, Volvo's T8 plug-in hybrid system has been incredibly good. Whether we're talking about it under the hood of the S60, the S90, the XC60, or the XC90 right here. When operating just as a hybrid without plugging it in, this vehicle has been getting us better fuel economy than the dedicated hybrids in this segment without a plug, while also been giving us significantly better performance. Although obviously there are things about the XC90 that I would love to change if I could, I think the XC90 has done an incredible job of staying relevant in this hotly competitive segment. Be sure and let me know what you think about all that down there in the comment section below. There are a ton of tasty options in this segment, so what would you pick if your own money were on the line? The Lincoln Aviator does have a very tasty and also very expensive plug-in hybrid system. It's certainly going to be a little swifter than this. It's an awful lot more powerful, but it's not as smooth as the Volvo hybrid system. That's my one complaint about the Ford and Lincoln hybrid system using their 10-speed automatic transmission. Bearing in mind that the vast majority of customers in this segment lease, I would get the XC90 personally over the Lexus RX or over the Acura MDX. I think this is an awful lot smoother as far as hybrid system operation than either of those hybrids. Certainly a lot smoother than the 9-speed automatic transmission that we find in the regular MDX. I would get this over the Infiniti QX60. I think it's a little bit harder of a choice between this and the X5 and the GLE. I would lean towards the XC90 for its style, for its comfort, etc. But let me know what you think about all that down there in the comment section below. And of course, stay tuned because the XC90 is going to be redesigned here relatively soon. We're already seeing some details dribbling out about the next generation of Volvo's SPA2 platform. And that XC90 is going to be built right here in the United States.